20 minutes.
Cathaoirleach. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to speak briefly on Budget 2018. In my own pre-budget 2018 submission, which I sent to Minister Donoghue last week, I highlighted the need for investment, especially in housing and public infrastructure and necessary public spending. And indeed, of course, recent opinion polls have highlighted that the majority of the electorate, they wanted to see that kind of significant investment this year, rather than even having an extra €4 or €5 in their pockets. So while there are a few small improvements today in areas like housing, health and education, in Deputy Donoghue's first budget. In particular, my overall first impression, Cathaoirleach, was one of deep disappointment and a sense of huge missed opportunities by this so-called government of opportunity. I also noted, of course, the glum faces of the Independent Alliance deputies and ministers, and it's clear that they were shafted by the Minister for Finance and the Taoiseach in the budget. Minister Finian McGrath, for example, has let down our citizens with disability and their advocates in this budget by only securing an additional €15 million in Budget 2014, just a tiny addition to the extra resources secured in Budget 2017 and barely keeping pace with inflation. Producing the necessary resources to implement the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has again been put on the back burner. While extra provision for the 1,500 18-year-old school leavers with disabilities is welcome, with intellectual disabilities, Minister McGrath and his department, they failed to address the increasing lists of hundreds of children assessed to be on the autistic spectrum who are waiting for early intervention supports, including preschool, and many of us would represent those parents of those children. In my personal submission to Minister Donoghue last week, I urged him to support major new investment in public transport for Dublin, Cork, Galway, Limerick and Waterford. I also reminded Deputy Donoghue that cities like New Delhi in India and a host of other Indian, Asian, European cities had begun to build out major city metro systems in the past 10 years. But Minister Ross's transport, tourism and sports budget, of course, has received miserly increases in Budget 2018. There's just €6.5 million, for example, for new tourism and cycling measures, and only an additional €15 million in all for additional resources. Minister Donoghue trumpeted a number of new bypasses and interchanges, but there is only €46 million in an increased capital envelope for 2018, barely above capital depreciation levels, Cathaoirleach. So Minister Ross has clearly lost all the budget battles, as indeed has Minister McGrath, and Minister Donoghue has once again totally ignored the Metro North project and light rail systems for our other Irish cities. Of course, he mentioned things like Bus Connects, but I mean, we have Network Direct, and Dublin Bus have been working on that for years. Minister Ross may say he helped to retain the 9% hospitality VAT rate, but the €600 million in lost tax expenditure and that now unnecessary tax cut, it would have greatly enhanced the health, disability and the transport budgets. Of course, I urge Minister Donoghue to taper the 9% rate back to 13% by 2021. Before looking at other key budget measures, Budget 2018 measures, I'd like to acknowledge the work of the Budgetary Oversight Committee. I see one of my colleagues here with us tonight, and the new Parliamentary Budget Office, whose staff are led respectively by Mr Ronan Murphy and Ms Annette Connolly. I think we've all benefited greatly on the committee in our understanding of the budgetary process and key fiscal issues. And it's regrettable, of course, the Minister didn't welcome the final establishment of the Parliamentary Budget Office under Director Annette Connolly in his speech earlier today. I believe the creation, indeed, of this Budgetary Oversight Committee and the Parliamentary Budget Office, along with the Special Health Committee and Special Housing Committee, will be enduring achievements of this 32nd Dáil. Budget 2018, as many citizens are noting, is a lost opportunity from a Taoiseach who spoke about an Ireland of opportunities. Deputy Varadkar and Donoghue could have done much more to alleviate the great distress of our citizens on housing and hospital waiting lists in particular, but they chose not to do so. The Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, of course, advised the Budgetary Oversight Committee that there was €2.2 billion of gross fiscal space for 2018, with a net fiscal space of only €0.65 billion or less. The Minister, of course, told us that the water charges refund and any Christmas bonus would be met from 2017 estimates, and that Minister Owen Murphy's proposed and desperately needed affordable housing scheme would be funded under the 2018 budget. And like Deputy Wallace, I'm still looking for that new affordable housing scheme. So we've been misled here by two ministers, Ceann Comhairle. Based on the IFAC estimates of fiscal space, the government could have raised at least €1.35 billion of net revenue from new taxes, efficiencies and the closing of unnecessary tax expenditures. And I note that IFAC and other witnesses at the Budgetary Oversight Committee who called for a prudent and neutral budget, they didn't rule out an expansionary fiscal stance, which the Minister certainly didn't take, once the net figure of fiscal space was maintained through new taxes and savings. But the Minister chose to expand current expenditure by only only 684 million and capital expenditure by only 214 million, while raising extra revenues of 830 million in a total budget day package of 1.2 billion. So a disappointing effort, I think, in this first and maybe last budget, has to be said, from Deputy Donoghue. Of course, we set this famous medium-term objective the Minister keeps referring to, the structural balance of minus 0.5% of GDP ourselves, as we have set this rod to beat our own backs. And it's widely believed that the common agreed methodology, the CAM, for the calculation of the output gap which determines our fiscal space, is totally unsuitable for Ireland. And I noticed that if Ireland was already at its own MTO, which we should have been maybe last year, permitted expenditure would be 4.7% of GDP and not the 2.4% set out in the summer statement or the increase today. And this would imply a gross fiscal space of 3.3 billion and far more scope than the Minister gave himself, in fact, today. I do agree with a generally balanced budget in 2018. Corla, but only in tandem with a significant additional investment in public services, especially in housing and health, from a widening of the tax base on including new taxes on wealth and very high earners. Minister, at the end of August, there were 3,048 homeless children, and this figure doesn't even include the children living in temporary domestic violence refuges. And the 2016 summary of social housing assessment showed that 91,600 households had a social housing support need at the end of September 2016. And of course, Professor Ronan Lyons recently estimated that the Irish demographic history and trends indicate we have a shortfall of 120,000 houses needed immediately, with annual output of 50,000 per annum needed for the foreseeable future. So everybody understands the necessity at some stage for Ireland to emulate countries like Norway and the Gulf states with a sovereign wealth fund. But given that there are 3,000 homeless children tonight in this city, Minister, and this country, and 700,000 citizens on hospital waiting lists, isn't it incredibly disrespectful and uncaring of Minister Donoghue to be talking about creating a rainy day fund with a 1.5 billion donation in 2018 and 0.5 billion euro annually after that? Isn't that an incredible slap in the face for people who desperately need housing this very evening, Corla? There are a few welcome developments in the budget for housing, planning and local government, but Minister Donoghue included the capital spend in the overall capital provision, 1.9 billion for social housing in 2018. He included the capital spend for 2017, once again in that. I welcome the capital funding of 1.14 billion for 5,100 social houses in 2018, but only 800 of these will be delivered by direct build. The 75 million for the local infrastructure housing activation fund seems very low, considering the amount of housing that we need, and only 53 million is included for the long waiting list for adaptation grants. And as deputies, of course, week in, week out, we get requests from our constituents, looking for adaptation extensions, and Minister, you simply haven't provided the necessary funding here tonight for this whole country. The Home Building Finance Ireland HBFI seems to be a very poor response to the many calls for the Minister for Housing to establish a state developer of housing or a national housing executive. We heard the proposal, for example, from the advocacy group NERI, Ireland's housing, I quote, Ireland's housing emergency, a time for a game changer, which asked us to build out the necessary homes on the European cost rental model. We've had many other proposals along those lines, but how will the 750 million from the Ireland Strategic Investment Fund be transferred to the HBFI to achieve a well-provided for and affordable new housing market? And once again, where is Minister Owen Murphy's new affordable housing scheme? Will HBFI be some sort of sister company of NAMA under NTMA? What's this link, as Deputy Wallace has been referring to, and how can it be justified? But Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil and the Independent Alliance haven't changed their tune at all in support for private developers and landlords. The dismally slow provision of social and affordable housing will clearly continue in 2018, and the 301 million allocated to HAP and 134 million for RAS, not to mention continuing huge amounts for rent supplement, clearly indicates that this is the case. And we know that £1 billion per annum is being spent on these kind of supports, and that billion, as you know, Minister, would be better off spent building houses in Athlone and every other town in this country. I referred earlier on to the health and disability budget, and Minister Donoghue mentioned an additional £685 million, including 2017 carryover expenditure. I welcome the allocation of £55 million to the National Treatment Purchase Fund, the £40 million for primary care and the small cut in prescription charges. But September figures, Minister, show that there are still 679,000 people on hospital waiting lists around the country, an increase of approximately 19,000 in August. And because some of the lists, of course, have seen reduction, it's been hailed as good news. But for those living in pain who call to us week in and week out, and I'm sure, Minister, at your information clinics, you'd also be getting people looking for a hip operation, for a knee operation, ophthalmology, cataracts, people whose sight is going, people with diabetes who are fearful of losing their sight. So I know we estimated that at least another £300 million should have been provided for these acute services to bring us up to some kind of OECD norm. Yet all we have is £35 million for the waiting list initiative and £50 million for acute hospital services. So again, a dismally disappointing health budget. Fully implementing a vision for change, of course, and I know that Can Corley have taken some good initiatives in this regard during the Dáil recess to address the poor level of service provision for mental health should have been an absolute priority. We still have a shortage of 3,000 skilled staff, psychologists and others who were necessary, I think, at a cost, Minister, additional cost of £128 million, but all we've got today is £35 million in this budget. As you remember, Can Corley, I've highlighted with my colleague here, my colleagues beside me, I've highlighted the injustice done to the staffs of Section 39 organisations several times on the floor of this Dáil. At a briefing I held in Dáil Éireann for other colleagues, the Irish Wheelchair Association and Rehab informed us that restoration of their salaries to the large Section 39 health providers would cost in the region of £14 million a year. But that £14 million was £14 million, Minister, you are not prepared to provide this year for key essential services of people who are effectively public servants. The Minister, of course, seemed delighted that he had reached the current and capital budget for education had reached a £10 billion mark, but current spending, of course, is just over £9 billion. My office, as indeed every other deputy, had strong representations from all three levels of education professionals and trade unions, including, of course, and also, of course, from preschool and postgrad. And at primary level, I've had detailed briefings from some of our school principals calling for a reduction in class size to EU norms. So I do welcome even the reduction of one today. But also for a significant rise in the capitation grant for primary schools, which we didn't have today, absolutely no provision. I've also, of course, continued to support the Equal Pay for Equal Work campaign for the younger teachers. So the cut in staffing ratios 26 to 1 is welcome, but the 545 extra teachers and 1,000 extra SNAs announced today barely keeps pace with our demographic trends. The 305 extra teachers, of course, that were also mentioned will be necessary to reduce the ratio. I urge Minister Donoghue to increase the National Training Fund levy from 0.7% to 1% this year for 2018 and in 2019-2020, and therefore raise to £100 million a year for the third level. So he started today with 0.7%, he says, to 0.8% in 2018, 0.9% 2019, 1% 2020. That's welcome, but it's only a tiny step. The Minister will also remember that I strongly oppose, and Independence for Change strongly oppose the introduction of student loans or increase in the student contribution. So I was pleased recently to hear that Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, who often seems to make up his Fine Gael policies standing in front of microphones, he said he's not convinced by the student loan proposal of the Cassell's report. However, it wasn't mentioned, I think, in the Minister's speech whether the proposal is abandoned, and Minister Broughan would seem to be still wanting that there should be student loans. We've all been looking at the social protection budget. Minister Doherty, of course, she was supposed to be, like Minister McGrath, battling away, desperately appearing on the 6 o'clock news, 9 o'clock news for huge additional resources for the clients of her Employment and Social Protection Department. But in actual fact, when you look at the budget of £20 billion, it's only a 1% increase in our budget of 2017, and you'll know, Cian, the 1% therefore it's £200 million. And when even Agriculture, the Department of Agriculture received a 4.5% increase. Of course, more than half of the budget is the current money in, money out budget of the Social Insurance Fund. And as in my submission last year, I believe constituents would have liked to have seen a minimum core social protection package of at least 430, 450 to 500 million. So the Minister secured well less than half of that, and perhaps at least a rise of €7 for all seniors, along with the general rise that's been included here. But I had hoped that Budget 2018 would have included a well-documented and costed gender equality analysis. I don't know whether if you saw it, Ken Corley, but I didn't notice in all these documents in front of us any kind of a gender equality analysis. I asked, for example, for an increase in the income disregard for one-parent families from 110 to 146.50 a week. So we got a small rise on that. I asked the same increase for job seekers' transitional payment would have cost approximately 4.2 million in a full year. I raised the issue, a huge issue, which I also raised on the floor of this Dáil, of the pre-2012 payments for the cohort of women workers who were on home caring duties before 1994, especially the women, who from the decades of the 1950s and 1960s, who in the brutal budget, of course, of 2012, were gravely disadvantaged, and now, as they're retiring, are down maybe 30 or 40 euros a week. And again, Minister Donoghue completely chose to ignore this area. We also asked, I think, for an increase in the back-to-school clothing and footwear allowances, and generally in further supports for children. And a critical, of course, equality issue is discrimination against young men and women under the age of 26. And again, once again, this Minister refused to do anything about that. So, as I said, in the interest of social and generational solidarity, I believe we should have had a package of at least 500 million this year. And of course, it's far less than that. And again, Minister Doherty, she didn't put up much of a fight for the constituents she represents, the many hundreds of thousands of people who are dependent on state pensions and state allowances. Any citizen, of course, who read the Coffey report on corporation tax and has followed the speeches of Commission President Jean-Paul Juncker and President Macron knows that widening our tax net and achieving a long-term sustainable tax base is a key responsibility of us legislators and ministers. I proposed to the Budgetary Oversight Committee that we should consider at least a third higher rate of income tax on higher incomes, the 180,000 tax units, for example, who earn over 100,000. A new rate, for example, of 43%. I have proposed 48% in the past, but 43% on those incomes would yield an additional 344 million. And of course, we do need much more transparency on wealth and high incomes, and that's why you might remember in the last Dáil, Can Corley, I brought forward a bill to create a high pay and wealth commission, which that last austerity government, in its wisdom, of course, decided to ignore and defeat. I welcome the moves to the fair revaluation of the local property tax from 2019. I believe we should still consider a site value tax, and economists like David McWilliams, of course, has proposed an interesting idea for a land tax. I asked in my own submission that the vacant site levy of 3% be at least doubled, and I note the comments of my colleague Deputy Wallace and his expertise in this matter, but it is welcome, I suppose, that the levy will increase from 3% to 7% in 2019. But clearly the government has taken every conceivable step not to encourage or not to force landholders to build. And of course, other tax widening sustainable measures which are also welcome include the sugar tax and also the tax on additional tax for health reasons, so on tobacco. But there were many other measures I think the Minister could have taken to widen the tax base. He could have increased betting duty, for example, to 3%, would have got 150 million. I've been asking for several years, Can Corley, for an aggregates levy, like the UK has, for €250 a tonne to improve recycling of building materials, as in the UK and Northern Ireland. That would have given him 80 million. And of course, if he'd abolished SARP, he'd have got an additional 10 million. I also asked him this year and last year to increase the duty on shares from 1% to 1.5%. That would have given an additional 220 million. So, as I think Deputy Wallace said, there's a lot of money out there. Was capacity to have had a much more innovative fiscal expansion this year, and we haven't had it. As I said, I believe the straight continuation of the 9% VAT in the hospitality sector, certainly in the Dublin region, is totally unjustified. I think also we have to make a start in equalising duty on diesel with petrol. And even though I drive a diesel car, I think we should have started this year, maybe over a number of years. It could bring in up to an additional 160 million. But years ago, I remember Deputy Ryan and others, when we were all in the City Council, we all knew that the PM10s and so on from diesel, it's unsustainable for health reasons in the long term. So I've always favoured higher taxes on citizens' households with very high income and great wealth, but I agree that there is a squeeze middle. So I do welcome the increase in the standard rate band for those citizens. So can I just say in conclusion, Can Corla, that the budget was very disappointing. It was indeed a missed opportunity. There could have been much more resources available for housing and health, and it's a particularly sad day, I think, for the Independent Alliance. They have been well and truly shafted, I think, by Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, and ignored by the Taoiseach and the Minister for Finance. And the result is that, as I said, in sectors like disability and transport, we could have done much better. Thanks, Can.
Deputy Broughan.